It's February 22nd, 2022. Welcome to Potkaars. My name is Rico Brouwer. I'm talking to a returning guest, Mr. Alfred Zayas. Before we do that, this is Potkaars. In Dutch is the pot with candle. Conversations of hope, people and conversations yet shed light. So I light one, as could all, at the start of a conversation. Welcome, Alfred Zayas. Welcome back.
Glad to be here again.
I asked you to talk with me about an article that you posted yesterday on the situation in Ukraine, and that thing has me worried, as does it everyone. Now I ask you, and this will be my introduction of you. See if I miss anything. Alfred Zayas, Professor of International Law at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations, expert in the field of human rights and international law, the United Nations independent expert on international order. How's that? Did I miss
That's
anything?
fine.
Yeah.
Secretary of the Human Rights Committee,
Yeah, fair enough.
Chief of Petitions Department, Registrar, anything you want. But main thing, I'm a book author, and I just put out my book,
Yep.
Building a Just
I got it
World
here.
Order, with Clarity Press in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm writing a new book also for Clarity Press that should be coming out in September of this year, 2022, under the title, The Human Rights Industry. And as I said, it's a very positive, constructive book, which indicates what the message of human rights is of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and what the obstacles are, and of course the politicization of human rights, the weaponization of human rights by politicians, journalists, the media, etc. So it is something that concerns all of us, because we want a better world for our children and grandchildren. We don't want a status quo, and we don't want privileges, and we don't want to leave anyone behind.
Yeah.
Having said that, we were dealing with Ukraine.
Exactly.
And
So we don't, what I would add is we also don't want it to deteriorate. Would you summarize the events that took place yesterday and over the last week?
Well, let's go to the origins of the crisis. Obviously, we want to have a comprehensive security architecture for all of Europe that does not leave Russia and Belarus and the rest of Eastern Europe out. Back in 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev did something really amazing. He decided that the Soviet system had to be reformed. He wanted glasnost, which is transparency, and perestroika, restructuring of the system. And he found a good partner in George H.W. Bush, and essentially he offered him to normalize relations, to engage in disarmament negotiations, to withdraw, that is the amazing thing, to withdraw Soviet troops from East Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia, etc. So that required a quid pro quo. And it was assured to him by our American Secretary of State, our Foreign Minister, James Baker, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastwards. Now, it is amazing how Anthony Blinken and how Jens Stoltenberg claimed that there was no such agreement. Well, sure, it was not written in stone.
Yesterday I saw some writing of
to a treaty that had to be signed and ratified, but it was part and parcel of the quid pro quo.
Yeah. What I was going to say is,
yeah,
there was a piece in writing of some United States internal conversation on the matter.
They're minutes.
Yeah,
minutes.
exactly.
That's what we call minutes. You know, like we're talking, and there is what they call précis writers, and précis writers are taking notes while the politicians are talking. And of course, that is recorded in the minutes. And those minutes, they were classified until recently, but they've been declassified. They're available for anybody to consult at the National Archives. 2 American professors have consulted them. They have confirmed that those assurances were given. Yeah. But of course, the mistake on the part of Gorbachev is that he was too trusting of the Americans and of NATO. And something that important, he should have made sure that it was in the written agreement that was subsequently signed.
Is that your analysis of how matters went? I mean, I can imagine that he would push for written statements, but he just didn't get them. Or
no. Apparently, he did not even push. As a matter of fact, he was interviewed about it.
Okay.
And he did not push to have it because his concern really was confidence building. The moment you demand things like that, you're saying, I don't trust you. So basically, it was a gentleman's agreement. And no one thought, not even the Americans thought, in 1989, 1991, that NATO would go all the way to the Baltic states and to Poland and to Czechoslovakia, etc., much less Ukraine and Georgia. And that idea emerged in the second half of the 1990s under Bill Clinton. He had a group of people around him, including Wolfowitz, and this was the doctrine of the neocons who wanted a project for the new American century. So the idea was a Pax Americana unipolar in which only the United States would be calling the shots. So when Gorbachev naively dismantles the Warsaw Pact, at that moment at least, he should have demanded that NATO either dismantles itself because there's no need for a defense alliance anymore, or that NATO evolves into a truly European security architecture that would also take into account the security interests of Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, etc. That did not happen. And I published in Counterpunch, that is an American news service, actually with quite a few readers and contributors. As the case may be, I published an article under the title NATO as Religion, meaning we believe in the West everything that NATO says, everything that Jens Stoltenberg says. We give it the benefit of the doubt, or matter of fact, we don't even have a doubt. We take it on faith. We assume that it's correct. And I wrote another article under the title, A Culture of Cheating. And unfortunately, although I am a proud American citizen, the fact is that we have a very bad record of not keeping written agreements and treaties, let alone gentlemen agreements. And the situation with the indigenous in the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of treaties with the indigenous, the Crees, the Cherokees, the Navajos, the Dakotas, Lakotas, and Sioux, etc., which we broke. I mean, no sooner was the ink on the paper that we were breaking the agreements again. And we've broken that kind of agreements with Spain, with Mexico, with the Philippines, with Hawaii, God knows how many countries. So Gorbachev should have known a little bit more history and been a bit wary about what he was doing. But going back to the source, The source of the problem is that already 2007, as President Vladimir Putin said at the security conference in Munich, he said, oh, look, you gave us assurances and you are pushing us against the wall. I mean, we don't like it. I mean, nobody likes to have missiles at his doorstep. And we remember that when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was not solved unilaterally. It was not a victory for John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the way the press tried to depict it, or the way you read it in some history books. I mean, that was a quid pro quo. The Soviet Union removed the missiles from Cuba, and the United States removed its missiles from Turkey. Quid pro quo. And that is what is missing in this case. You have a Leistung, a performance, really a tremendously, shall we say, generous act on the part of Russia to withdraw from all of the territory it occupied. And there is no corresponding act on the part of NATO. Matter of fact, NATO needs an enemy. If NATO doesn't have an enemy, the military-industrial complex doesn't turn. They need, for their own raison d'etre, an enemy. And of course, for a time, they continue developing not as a defense alliance, but as an offensive alliance. And then they engage in all sorts of illegal offensive acts, aggressions, as 1999 against Yugoslavia, from 2001, 2002 in Afghanistan, 2003 in Iraq, 2011 in Libya, from 2011 to this day in Syria, etc., etc. So NATO is actually a problem, and NATO must actually reinvent itself. If NATO continues acting the way it acts, NATO essentially, look at the London Agreement of the 8th of August 1945, Article 9. What does Article 9 do? It defines the concept of a criminal organization. Apply Article 9 to a NATO, and it fits. Okay. The way NATO has been acting, aggressing so many countries, interfering in the internal affairs of so many countries, that is the definition of a criminal organization. But going back to the specifics of the Ukrainian situation.
Maybe take it one step back to your book, because in this yes. you describe not so much NATO, but how the United Nations could reinvent itself. And we will get back to what you say in here with an example in your chapter 5. But the point that you make...
I have 25 principles of international order. And if they were applied, we would have peace in the world. And they've been welcomed by politicians, by United Nations officials. The president of the General Assembly back in 2018, 2019, referred to my 25 principles as a Magna Carta for the 21st century. Of course, I'm not reinventing the wheel. I am not discovering the Mediterranean. My 25 principles are very solidly anchored in the United Nations Charter, which, as you might say, is a world constitution. But beyond that, it is anchored in resolutions 2131, 2625, 3314, 39/11, 60/1, etc.
Okay.
So they are very, very much an incorporation or a construction that builds on everything else that has been done in the field of international law for peacekeeping and international order.
let's talk in a different interview about your book and go into depth on this thing. Also,
Sure.
I have to say, my friend Roger Morich talked to you about this. So let's continue that conversation on a later date. For now, I want to dig into the situation in Ukraine. And you mentioned NATO. I have a question on that. But before I go there, in the address Mr. Putin gave yesterday, he references NATO. I mean, that's what he claims. It's the behavior of NATO that makes him take his actions. Now, so I want to go into that, but just to finish with a question on Mr. Gorbachev back in '89. It is my understanding that the Warsaw Pact started when Germany joined NATO. I'm pretty sure Gorbachev knew his history about that thing. So it is somewhat of history repeating now, no?
Well, there was a great concern on the part of Gorbachev, and that was discussed, that Germany basically should not be in NATO anymore. And there was an enormous concession on the part of Gorbachev that he would agree to Germany remaining in NATO and to the new East Germany, the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, that had been in the Soviet sphere, that they too could be in NATO. But that required a quid pro quo. The problem is that this good man Gorbachev didn't insist on having that put into the treaty as a conditio sine qua non to the validity of that treaty. But leaving that, what are the issues here? In December, and that's where the discussion should be located. It's surrealistic what's going on if you read the media. The media is only talking about the Ukraine. Now, this whole thing starts when in December 2021, Russia puts forward two proposals for a new European security architecture. And I've read the proposals, they're quite reasonable. Basically, all he's asking is, look, you've expanded, contrary to your assurances, you've expanded eastwards. We're not asking you to roll back. We're not asking you to undo what has happened before. But let's agree that you don't expand right to my doorstep, that you don't enter countries that are very closely associated with Russia and Russian history. Let's not forget the great Alexander Nevsky was the great Prince of Kiev. This is prior to Moscow. I mean, Russia, in its history, starts in Ukraine and moves east. So in any event, the emotional relationship between Russia and Ukraine is very close. So they don't want Ukraine suddenly to become an enemy. They don't want to see Ukraine occupied by the United States, essentially. And to have the United States station missiles in the Ukraine next door to Russia, the same as Khrushchev was very uncomfortable with the nuclear missiles that were stationed in Turkey in 1962, and that's why they put their Soviet missiles in Cuba. So you want to have a disarmament, you want to have good relations between the United States and Russia, well, let's jointly agree to disarm.
So hang on. You were going into what happened in December. Russia made proposals, and now we're in the situation that Mr. Putin...
They're not discussing the proposals. Essentially, NATO rejected them.
Okay.
Essentially, the United States rejected them. They said, we will continue expanding, as we will, because the idea of the open door policy, what they call, this is a slogan, is a core principle of NATO. Well, sorry, exactly that is what has to be changed. I mean, it's not a divine revelation. It's not a core principle anchored in international law. It is just an agreement. I will threaten you and I will continue threatening you. And that is a core principle. Give me a break. I mean, the level of bad faith of Jens Stoltenberg is, as the French say, hallucinant, is breathtaking. And it is being picked up by the press and repeated, like if there's any legitimacy to that. What is legitimate is the question of the human rights of the people of the Ukraine, including the people who live in Luhansk and Donetsk.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, why do we have this problem? Very easy. Go back 8 years. On the 21st of February 2014, when the coup d'etat was in progress, Germany, Poland, France intervened. They reached an agreement between Maidan, the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, and they signed an agreement whereby elections would be anticipated, and there would be a possibility for the opposition to take power, if indeed they had the majority behind them, which I'm not at all sure that they did. I mean, there was a lot of money, and let's face it, the non-governmental organizations financed by USAID, by the National Endowment for Democracy operating in Ukraine, were Trojan horses. They were foreign agents acting on behalf of the United States in order to destabilize the government of Yanukovych. And you may remember the telephone calls that were recorded, where you have my Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, essentially saying who should be minister of this and who should be prime minister, etc., etc. It is breathtaking how, to what extent, there was direct United States interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine, which is completely contrary to the final act of Helsinki. I mean, you have the final act of Helsinki.
Hang on, before you move into that, I want to extend on Victoria Nuland. First, with a small joke, if you may. Are you going to quote her telephone call on my show or not?
Well, you'll have to do beep, beep, because she uses a four-letter word. It's only laughable, because she just deprecates the European Union as being totally irrelevant. You know, we are calling the shots. We, the United States, we determine what government is going to be in the Ukraine, not the
well, yeah, exactly. Union. So what I was going to say is Victoria Nuland, Undersecretary of State for the United States at that time, also is on YouTube, you can find it online, made a statement at a Chevron-funded event that the United States invested $5 billion to promote regime change.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The NGOs are foreign agents. The same NGOs are tantamount to Trojan horses. So that's why there's legislation in Russia. Actually, there's legislation in the United States. We have the Foreign Agents Act that obliges God knows how many Russian businessmen and Russian media outlets, etc., and Russian activists to register as foreign agents. So if you are being financed from a foreign country, I think it's legitimate that you are listed so that you know that everybody knows where your money comes from. And money talks. Everybody knows that. But what happened on the 22nd of February, one day after this treaty was signed, is that one party to the treaty, Maidan, the leaders of the so-called color revolution, actually broke the agreement and tried to run into the presidential palace to kill Yanukovych. And Yanukovych was lucky that he was able to helicopter himself to safety and escape. But that was a vulgar putsch. That was a vulgar coup d'etat, like so many that we have seen in Latin America. And we, who are supposed to be the leaders of democracy in the world, we have financed a coup d'etat. It was not homegrown. And you may remember, because there were a lot of false flags in Maidan, that the then foreign minister of Estonia, could have been Latvia, one of the two. I remember that he also, one of his telephone calls was overheard, or rather recorded, and it was then also publicized, in which he said that the snipers and those who were killing civilians were not the government, from the government. They were not from Yanukovych. But that actually has disappeared from the narrative. You can get it in the internet if you look for it, but you don't find it in the pages of the New York Times,
what we find,
Post, Wall Street Journal, etc.
What we find in Dutch newspapers now is that the Netherlands is selling defensive sniper rifles to Ukraine. But
Well, actually,
they're whitewashing
it's
it.
surrealistic. I must say, I would go beyond the word surrealistic. It is Rusophobia. It is a really vulgar xenophobia aimed against the Russians. The Russians are the bad guys. So that is the only role that comes to them. No matter that they don't want to be our enemies, we need them as enemies. That is their role, because otherwise NATO has no raison d'etre. But what did we do? What did the European Union do? There is an unconstitutional change of government. There is an attempt on the life of Yanukovych. And the very same day, they recognize the putschists. They recognize those who broke the agreement, and they go as if nothing had happened. And they recognize this as a legitimate government. This is a totally illegitimate government. This is an unconstitutional change of power, contrary to a written agreement and contrary to the goodwill promised by Yanukovych to hold anticipated elections. So that is the source of all the problem. And then not only are they illegitimate and illegal, they start adopting legislation and in this new wild parliament against Russian speakers, prohibiting the use of the Russian language, etc. If you happen to be a Russian in Luhansk and in Donetsk or in Crimea, you have reason to feel threatened. You have reason to be menaced. And the Crimeans, who had a history of independence and who had, shall we say, very little link, certainly zero emotional link to Kiev, but very ethnic or, shall we say, historical links. As you know, Crimea had nothing to do with Ukraine, except that in the mid-1950s, Khrushchev, who was a Ukrainian, administratively transferred this Crimean oblast from Russia to Ukraine, something that, of course, in the mid-50s had no consequences for the people. Everything was decided in Moscow anyway. So whether you were in one of the 15 republics, whether you were in the Russian Republic or the Ukrainian Republic, it was the same thing. Mm. So they didn't object. The problem came in 1991 when Ukraine, contrary to the provisions of the Soviet Constitution, decided to separate itself without observing all the steps that were required in order to declare your independence. Something, by the way, which immediately the European Union applauded and recognized as legitimate. But as the case may be, at that moment, they should have thought, why don't we ask the people concerned? Why don't we ask the Crimeans, who are really not Ukrainians, whether they want to belong to Ukraine or Russia? Nobody thought of that, also not the United Nations. So it is partly the fault of the United Nations that it did not organize and monitor referenda at that stage. Now, when I was the representative of the Secretary General back in 1994 for the elections in the Ukraine, I mean, I speak Russian and I traveled the country, I crisscrossed the country. And I remember very distinctly going to, that was March 1994, that was for the parliamentary elections. I went the second time for the presidential elections. I met Kuchma and Kravchuk, etc. In any event, I was in March 1994 in Crimea, and I go to visit the president of the autonomous region of Crimea. I just want to say, look, I'm here in Simferopol. I'm going to be observing the elections, etc., in the name of the United Nations. And you know what he says? Господин Zayas, а вы знаете, что мы русские? He tells me, Mr. Zayas, do you know we're Russians? And for me, I felt like saying, look, I don't care. I mean, none of my business. I mean, you can be anything you want. You can be Chinese. You can be Malaysian. I'm coming here only for one purpose, to monitor the elections, which, by the way, were okay. So 20 years later, when this happened in Maidan, I'm not at all surprised that the Crimeans said, forget it. We don't recognize this illegal government, and we don't want to stay with these nuts in Kiev. So they conduct a referendum on the 14th of March, 2014. They invite the OECD. They invite the United Nations to come monitor. Do they come to monitor? No. But of course, afterwards, they say that they're illegitimate. These referenda, of course, you can't have it both ways. Ex injuria non oritur jus. If you yourself don't want to come and monitor, then shut up. In any event, the parliament. Yeah.
Let's move into United Nations and OSCE then. So just to recap, yesterday, President Putin recognized Donetsk and Luhansk and said, I'm going to provide military support if they need it, if they want it. And after that, a Security Council meeting took place. Rosemary DiCarlo, United Nations Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, said, and she quoted Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in his statement today, the Secretary General was clear. He considers the decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the independence of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions to be a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. We very much regret this decision, which risks having regional and global repercussions. Now, Mr. Zayas, would you tell me what's in the Charter of the United Nations ruling self-determination and the right to secession if you need it?
Well, the right of self-determination of peoples, and that I'm saying all peoples, is anchored in Articles 1 and 55 of the United Nations Charter, but is also anchored in innumerable resolutions of the General Assembly and Security Council. Now, I must demur, I must disagree with the Secretary General on this, because self-determination is jus cogens. Self-determination is a right that attaches to people, and it is not a matter for states to grant or deny it. It is not their prerogative. It is a right of peoples, and it's been confirmed any number of times by the International Court of Justice. Take the Nicaragua case of 1986, but also take the advisory opinion of the ICJ 2010 with regard to the unilateral declaration of independence of Kosovo. Paragraph 80 is very clear. It makes reference to Resolution 2625, Resolution 3314, makes resolution to the final act of Helsinki. And it says that the principle of of territorial integrity is exclusively for external use, meaning you cannot use it to frustrate a jus cogens right of self-determination. So it means if a country comes, like Israel, comes and occupies Palestine, or comes and occupies the Golan Heights, expels the population, and then pretends to annex those territories. Here, the United Nations is obliged to protect the territorial integrity, say, of Syria and the Golan Heights. But in the case of Crimea, for instance, there's no annexation when you have a referendum followed by a declaration of independence of the competent authorities of the parliament. Then you find a formal request of reunification with Russia, considering that Crimea was part of Russia, which is then tested in the Russian parliament. And only after the Russian parliament says, okay, you can be reincorporated, that is then tested still by the Constitutional Court of Russia. And only then is it signed by Putin in 2014. So it went through all the steps of the rule of law, all the steps of the état de droit, of the Rechtsstaat. So it has nothing to do with annexation, although the media continues repeating that. With regard to Donetsk and Luhansk, they fought their war of independence against this illegal government in Maidan, and then there was a ceasefire, and then you had the 2014 Minsk agreement, which the Ukraine systematically violated, which then, as a result, led to new violence, new armed conflict. And then there was the second Minsk agreement of 2015. And that is 7 years ago. Now, the core article in this Minsk agreement is that Ukraine committed itself to negotiate directly, not with Putin, not with Russia. Ukraine committed itself to negotiate with the leaders of Luhansk and Donetsk to find a modus vivendi whereby they would get what is termed in international law internal self-determination. They would have an autonomous status, and they would be able to obviously not only use their language and practice their culture and their beliefs, etc., but they would have a large measure of autonomy. In 7 years, Poroshenko and Zelensky violated that core principle, that core Article 11 of the Minsk Agreement. What does that tell you? Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Article 60. If one party to a treaty violates materially something really essential to the object and purpose of the treaty, as Ukraine did by doing nothing to implement that, then the other parties are free to withdraw. So it's not Putin who killed the Minsk Agreement of 2015. It was Poroshenko and Zelensky who killed the Minsk Agreement. Now, if the Minsk Agreement, and gosh, they've been negotiating the Normandy format and all of these last 4 or 5 weeks we've seen negotiations, and two things emerge from those negotiations. Zelensky has no intention to implement Minsk, and NATO has every intention to continue expanding. So basically a slap in the face of Putin saying, look, we don't care what you think. You're not going to get a new security assurance from NATO, and we will incorporate Ukraine into NATO, and we will put our missiles there, and we will incorporate Georgia. And then what can Putin do in that situation? I mean, if you leave him no options, if you refuse to act in conformity with the United Nations Charter, that in Article 2, Paragraph 3, obliges you to negotiate. Okay, you negotiate, and as Lavrov said, it's like the dialogue of the deaf. I mean, when Liz Truss went to see Lavrov in Moscow, I mean, it was a disgrace. I mean, she does not address any of the issues that are on the table. She just makes accusations that you're going to invade the Ukraine. And you remember what the media was telling us. They even had decided that intelligence had determined that Putin was going to invade Ukraine on the 15th of February. When it did not happen on the 15th, they said the 16th. So, I mean, what credibility do we have? And what kind of intelligence do we have when, I mean, all of these reports that we're getting day in, day out, they're based on anonymous information, based on secret documents, secret intelligence. And the amazing thing is that people repeat the garbage that they're getting in the press, and they don't understand that there are reasons for what is happening in Luhansk and in Donetsk. I mean, I am convinced, having been in the Ukraine, that these people have a very, very close identification with Russia. And that being the case, and looking at the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in the Kosovo case, of course they have a right to exercise self-determination. They would have opted for internal self-determination if Ukraine had budged a little bit, but Ukraine refused to budge at all, probably because they had assurances from the United States that they would back them up. And of course, they have flown in tons and tons of weapons into the Ukraine. And this reminds me of something else. This reminds me of 2008. 2008, Tbilisi, capital of Georgia, was full of CIA and full of Mossad, full of American and Israeli advisors pushing Saakashvili to take Southern Ossetia and Abkhazia by force. Saakashvili assumes that he has the support of the US and Israel. He can go ahead and do it. And he launches this blitzkrieg against Southern Ossetia. But there was an agreement. There were Russian peacekeepers there. There was an agreement since 1994, and it was holding. So he wants to take it by force, violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. You're not supposed to threaten with the use of force, or much less are you allowed to use force to change a status quo, a situation like that. So what happened is that Putin, again, he's not the one who is starting the problem. But what is he going to do? His peacekeepers are there. What is he going to do? He's the guarantor of the peace in Southern Ossetia and in Abkhazia. So obviously, 5-day war, he moves in, he mops up the Georgians, but he knows his limits. He doesn't go as far as the capital and goes and kicks Saakashvili in the rear as he deserved. He stops and goes home. He says, okay, I have settled the problem, but then since you're not serious in keeping agreements, I am going to recognize the independence of Southern Ossetia and Abkhazia, which, by the way, in terms of international law, is totally legal. The same as the recognition of Luhansk and Donetsk is totally legal. And what he did after the recognition, on the request of these governments, is to bring in peacekeepers to prevent, or rather to dissuade, Ukraine from trying to take it by force, as Saakashvili had unsuccessfully done it. But maybe Zelensky was thinking of something else. Don't forget, November 2020. Well, that was the ceasefire. September, 28 September 2020. You have this criminal, President Aliyev of Azerbaijan, conducting a blitzkrieg with massive civilian losses against Nagorno-Karabakh, the Republic of Artsakh, the Armenian Republic of Artsakh. And besides killing tens of thousands and engaging in torture and really serious, very serious war crimes and crimes against humanity, he got away with it. Here you have a classic example of illegal use of force, violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, in total impunity. Europe couldn't give a damn. The European Union did nothing to protect the rights of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. So with that precedent only barely a year and a half ago, even less, maybe Zelensky thought this is a moment to, throw my army against these rebels and take Luhansk and Donetsk back. Now, the idea of territorial integrity, I am a believer, I'm a professor of international law, I am a believer in the right of territorial integrity of states because it provides stability. But there is no stability in forcing a people who do not want to be under your rule, forcing them to stay in a union that does not have viability. And let me read to you the Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in the same language, Article 1 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And for good reason, that is Article 1 of the Covenant. It's considered to be the basis, and on this article you build the others. I mean, so in the eyes of the drafters, 1966, when they adopted the covenants, they decided that all peoples, and I repeat, all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Without a doubt, the Russians of Donetsk and of Luhansk are people, and they have a right to invoke that. And that, of course, has been confirmed in the case of the Kosovars in the advisory opinion of 2010. Now, Article 1, Paragraph 3 is even more interesting because it says that all governments, all states parties to these two human rights covenants, which are part and parcel of the International Bill of Human Rights. Now, the states parties to the present covenant shall promote the realization of the right of self-determination and shall respect that right in conformity with the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations. Meaning, not only do the peoples have the right, but the states have the obligation to enforce it. Meaning, in the moment that the Russian population of Donetsk and Luhansk no longer want to be part of Ukraine, either you negotiate with them to give them internal self-determination in the form of autonomy within a federal state or whatever, or you let them go. What is insane is to fight a war against a jus cogens principle of international law, which is self-determination. That is the crux of the matter. But you don't read that in the mainstream media. You don't read that in the narrative that you get. Not even from the United Nations you get that narrative. Of course, there are numerous professors of international law that fully agree with me, and I'm in correspondence with at least a dozen of professors in Norway, in Germany, in France, in Switzerland, in the United States, in Canada, who say the world has gone mad. Because how can you even conceive of killing people to prevent them from exercising the right of self-determination? At least sit with them, at least talk with them. And that is what Zelensky refused to do, although it was specifically provided for in Article 11 of the Minsk agreements. And then if I bring in the Helsinki Final Act, and that of course is the birthplace of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OECD depends on this Helsinki Final Act that guarantees the right of self-determination, Article 6, and that prohibits specifically the interference of NATO states, for instance, in the internal affairs of Ukraine. So I say the coup d'etat that the Americans, Victoria Nuland, and the American ambassador, Geoffrey Pyatt, and everybody else who was involved in this vulgar coup d'etat, I mean, they all violated the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. Now, where do we go from here? Well, I'm hoping for, okay, there will be sanctions against Russia. Russia has endured many, many sanctions before, but people have to understand that there's such a thing as national honor. There's such a thing as intellectual honesty. And you're not always willing to compromise on those things. And the Russians are prepared to endure more sanctions. By the way, illegal sanctions, but sanctions nonetheless. You just read that Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, has suspended the process of certification of Nord Stream 2. Well, a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money with that. But whether Baerbock likes it or not, Europe needs energy. And much of that energy comes from Russia. And Russia is not going to suffer much because China has an enormous capacity to absorb this energy. So whatever the Russians don't sell in Europe, they'll sell it to Russia, to China, or sell it to some other countries who do appreciate the fact that either the liquefied gas or the regular gas or the petroleum is available to turn the wheels of industry in China and elsewhere. If the Europeans want to do without it, and then they want to buy the much, much more expensive liquefied gas that Biden wants to sell the Europeans. Okay, if you want to be stupid, go ahead.
Okay, we have to stop at some point in this conversation. Let's try to move to an end here. I am gonna quote as a leading into final question an article that you posted yesterday about the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. In it, you mentioned the Polish dilemma. What is important is to exercise common sense and stop the warmongering. And you go into Poland and all the other things that we already mentioned in this conversation, all the international institutions, United Nations, NATO, European Union, but specifically Poland. Now, I heard President Putin made a statement that the flow of natural gas from Russia as a seller to European Union has not changed. I mean, they're meeting their obligations. However, it's not being sent through those pipes to Poland. Rather, it's going to the European Union, then to Poland, and then back into Ukraine. They've reversed the flow of gas through that.
It is totally absurd and abnormal. It is counterproductive. It makes it much more expensive for the Poles, much more expensive for the Europeans. Now, what is interesting is that Putin has not used his leverage and has not threatened with closing the tap. And he's not intending to close the tap. He just wants to cooperate. But the Europeans, you know, I'm a Catholic. I'm a practicing Catholic. And we have not only the 10 Commandments, we also have the 7 capital sins. And you know which is the first and worst of the 7 capital sins? It's arrogance. It's hubris. It's intransigence. And that is what the European countries have been actually committing on a daily basis. When I hear Jens Stoltenberg speak, or I hear Boris Johnson, or I hear Emmanuel Macron, I mean, give me a break. I mean, why don't you come down from your high horse? Why don't you decide the Russians have interests too? They have a right to their security too. They're not asking NATO to roll back. They just don't want to be constantly menaced by NATO. And NATO, as I said, has evolved from what was originally a defensive alliance into an alliance that only threatens. It's an alliance that is only there to push the geopolitical interests of the United States. And unfortunately, the Europeans let themselves be led by the nose, and the Europeans go along with the American agenda. I would hope that sooner or later, better sooner than later, the Europeans decide that they have their own interests, and their own interests do not coincide with the interest of the United States of America, and that the Europeans should have their own energy policies and their own national security policies. Russia is not menacing anybody. And Russia is not menacing, as it was not menacing Georgia in 2008. If Saakashvili doesn't move, Putin would not have moved either. If Poroshenko or Zelensky had implemented in good faith Article 26, Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties, Pacta Sunt Servanda, if they had implemented the Minsk agreements, you wouldn't have this problem. And as I said, it could have been solved through internal self-determination.
Today, the world is afraid that we're on the brink of a war, of a shooting war, or whatever other weapons might be used this time. We saw the situation in Crimea there were tensions there too, but it resolved peacefully. Moving forward, do you see this thing escalating out of control, or is there a lot?
No, I don't. I think the Europeans and the Americans realized that a confrontation with Russia is a lose-lose proposition. No one is going to win that one. And of course, it has the danger of escalating into nuclear warfare, and then of course the entire planet goes. But I don't think that they think that far. I mean, they are playing a chess game. Everyone is playing in his own way a chess game, and they want to, push Russia into a corner, and as they did with Yeltsin. I mean, if Gorbachev had remained president, not only of the Soviet Union, but then president of Russia, and not this corrupt drunkard Boris Yeltsin, the catastrophe that hit Russia would not have happened, or would not have been that severe. What happened is that Putin, who, whether you like him or not, I do speak Russian, and I am a great admirer of Turgenev and of Dostoevsky and of Russian music and Russian ballet, etc. But I have no particular liking for the person of Vladimir Putin. He's, to me, as, shall we say, leaves me as cold as Emmanuel Macron. He's not my type of guy. On the other hand, I have the capacity of putting myself in his shoes and try to understand the tragedy of Russia. And I do recognize that it is Vladimir Putin who literally caught Russia in free fall. I mean, but for Putin, Russia today either would have dissolved or would be a banana republic. Whereas Russia, again, is a player on the world scene. And what has not been sufficiently recognized is that our stupid, hyper stupid politics have driven Russia and China into an alliance and a commonality of interest, because they see they want to cooperate, but the West doesn't want to cooperate. So their commercial relations, trade, their cultural exchanges have flourished over the past few years. And if you had had a George F. Kennan in the State Department instead of this pretty boy Antony Blinken, I think you would have had an intelligent strategy to try to play Russia against China and China against Russia. What we've done is to bring them together, and we're going to pay a high price for that, because China, whether we like it or not, is an economic giant, and they will definitely
let's wrap
beyond our capabilities in the short term, not even in the medium term. So accept the fact that the world is in flux and try not to antagonize people. I mean, the arrogance, as I said, going back to the 7 capital sins. I mean, the arrogance of against Stoltenberg becomes almost ridiculous. It becomes laughable in this situation, because we are not what we were.
But
We're not that powerful anymore.
final question then. Did you hear whose name was mentioned to succeed Jens Stoltenberg as head of NATO?
Oh, yes. Actually, I like Rutte.
Ah!
I like Rutte. I would much rather see Rutte than some of the other candidates. I think, Rutte has more common sense.
You think?
Than I think so. Because it's a man of compromise. He's not an ideologue. And I am afraid of ideologues. I want someone who will try to, I wouldn't mind having a housewife in that post, who knows how to do, her shopping list and knows, where to cut corners, etc. I'm afraid that if you are too rich and too powerful, as NATO is, that you lose a sense of reality. And again, Rutte would not be the worst. But what makes me, the metaphor of the revolving door. Isn't it just sweet? Isn't it just wonderful that Jens Stoltenberg is now being rewarded by being the head of the bank in Norway? Yes, he gets a great promotion now. And he'll get probably 3 times the salary that he has as NATO Secretary General.
Alfred Zayas, it was a pleasure talking to you again. Maybe close with this thing. If the ball is in the corner of Russia and China, and who knows, Mark Rutte at NATO, then it's their job to build a just world order. You've written somewhat of a manual for that.
Well, we'll be working at it. And as I said, I am speaking in the Human Rights Council in one of the side events. We will be dealing with these issues. So I am, as long as a good God gives me good health, I intend to continue irritating people. And I ask your listeners, by the way, for my new book on the human rights industry, send me your insights, send me your ideas, your observations on double standards. That's one of the major problems. If you see Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the International Service for Human Rights, how they have weaponized human rights and how they apply it today this way, tomorrow that way, how they apply it against this country, but they don't talk anything about the other. Those examples is what I'm trying to give to the public, to the reading public, so that they are sensitized to the fact that quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who will guard the guardians? We are the only people who can actually make sure that democracy works. If we leave it in the hands of people with salaries in the 600,000, they have their own club. They do their own thing, and we're left behind.
Thank you. We'll talk again.
Pleasure.
Take care.
Het gaat hier vandaag over saamhorigheid.
Dagje zonder hemel.
Rustig, lieg niet. Normaal maken, wat niet is normaal.
Every
nation
blauwe
in every region now has a decision to make.
En dan ook geen hel meer.
You think I'm joking? Predator
Dat
drones.
is best makkelijk.
You will never see it coming.
Wat dacht je, alle mensen
Laat staan dat ik kan ingaan over vuur.
bezig met vandaag.